thank you, Dean Carter, Reverend Brooks, and all those that are gathered. I would that you pray with me for just a few moments. God, look beyond the idiosyncrasies and the inadequacies of this your earthen vessel, that your name may be glorified and your nature magnified. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I would that you come with me to John's Gospel. There's a very familiar passage that I would like to lift from the first chapter of John, the 14th verse. I'll be reading out of the Message translation. John, the first chapter, verse 14, simply reads, "And the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood." For a few moments of our time, I would like to preach this text, this thought, and hang my homiletical hat upon this phrase: it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
All right.
Growing up, one of my favorite shows was to watch Mr. Rogers' television series. Not so much because I was encapsulated by the moral of the story that came at the end of the show, but more so because of the catchy tune that Mr. Rogers sung at the beginning of every song. Certainly you all know the song that Mr. Rogers used to sing. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I've always wanted a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine?
Yes, sir.
At the end of the song, Mr. Rogers used to pose a question that simply asked, won't you be my neighbor? And as Mr. Rogers speaks from his Presbyterian background from time to eternity today, I have to ask Mr. Rogers, have you seen our neighborhoods lately?
Yes, sir.
The neighborhoods of Newtown, Connecticut, where citizens are seemingly wrestling with questions of theodicy and searching for answers about their loved ones' deaths, and some egregious religious official suggests that the reason that God did not protect the 20 children and the 6 individuals who were shot is because the government banned prayer in public school. It seemingly is not a beautiful day in our neighborhood. Mr. Rogers, have you seen our neighborhoods in Washington, where Congress seemingly cannot come to a middle ground on the fiscal cliff, causing taxes to go up, consequently affecting Medicare and the Department of Defense's budget tremendously? Mr. Rogers, have you seen the neighborhoods where young children are being molested by pastors and politicians alike? Mr. Rogers, have you seen middle-class neighborhoods in Sanford, Florida, where the Trayvon Martins of the world are being gunned down for looking suspicious? Mr. Rogers, have you seen the poor neighborhoods in Chicago where life is not valued, so plight persists and perplexities are always pervasive? But in his response, Mr. Rogers says that there is hope for the hood because there's a new neighbor in town. He pointed me to John's supplemental gospel today. John, you know John, the son of Zebedee. John, who has an affinity with divinity. Here in this particular text today, he surmises that there is a replica of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood before us today. John, who has a high Christology and a low anthropology, gives an obscure observation on the ontological understanding of the Christ. Unlike Matthew and Luke, this narrative does not deal with the nativity of Jesus, as the synoptic gospels do. Rather, it focuses on the divinity of Jesus' humanity. John's gospel is one of a theophany, meaning that it deals with the physical appearance and the manifestation of God in a non-traditional sense. Yet this Johannine literature, esoteric in its nature, fails to humanize Jesus. And perhaps that's where we've gone wrong in the universal church today, is that we have deified Jesus, all the while dehumanizing Jesus, and so much that we have made him our exception and not our example. Mr. Rogers says, there is one who would like to be your neighbor, but his own received him not. So I beckoned Mr. Rogers, tell me a little bit about this neighbor. And John says, this person, first and foremost, is qualified to become your neighbor because this person has undergone a transformation. This person has undergone a transformation. Rice, if you made it up. No, it's in the text in verse number 14. Listen closely. The text says, and the word became flesh. That lets me know that there's a metamorphosis. There's a change and there is a transformation. But upon further studies of linguistic anthropology and etymology, one will find that that word comes from the derivative logos, which had rich cultural meaning in the background of the early Christian church. Given great significance first by the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, the logos created unity and a pattern of existence in our cosmology. Thus, the word logos gives order and clarity to life. Otherwise, there is chaos during creation as the deity wrestles in darkness. But then check that word became. Because that word became in Greek comes from the word genomai, which means to become. But here it is. It signifies a change of state, condition, or place. It was John Dewey who, by way of Jason Hill's book, Becoming a Cosmopolitan, what it means to be a human being in a new millennium, put forth and proffered a theory known as the metaphysics of becoming, in which he suggested that humanity is in a constant state of evolving, and that in our evolution, the purpose of our evolution is to become God itself. So now he says that the word has become flesh. There are biological implications and social ramifications that arise from this particular pericope because the text says that the word became flesh, which suggests to me that our flesh is inherently good, antithetical to the Orthodox Church's position of flesh and humanity being sinful by nature and Augustine's notions of original sin. So we see this radical sanctioning of humanity as Jesus becomes the express image of God through humanity. And what this text has been tailored to teach us today is that God reveres human personality enough to become incarnate and live among us. And that our best is better than filthy rags. So a more accurate interpretation of this text would say that the logos, genomai, flesh, which really means that the pattern for our existence and cosmology changed and transformed through something that has historically been looked down upon once Jesus showed up. Jesus, the one who taught us about God's humanity and humanity's divinity. And I like that because it suggests that Jesus established a new world order through something that has been historically demonized. And that's what the word ought to do, not condemn people or seek to exploit certain individuals in ethnic enclaves, but it ought to change patterns and confront policies and change politics and correct procedures, not to hurt nor to hinder, but always to help and to heal God's people. But not only, my sisters and my brothers, must our word be transformed. It must be transformative in its nature. If it does not possess the peculiar power to transform, then I would surmise that we have no word at all. We must then move from our embedded theology to a more deliberative, liberating theology to push back the frontiers of ignorance and become pioneers of social change and renaissance. We must engage in biblical hermeneutics for the 21st century and become transformed non-conformists, lest we have no veridical truth. Our word must have the profundity and the proclivity, the potency to transform the global village and the society in which we live and interact. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood because the word experiences a transformation. But not only do we see that the word experiences a transformation, we find secondly that in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, the word has a means of transportation. So look at what the text says. It says that the word became flesh. And then it says, and it moved into the neighborhood. And so once it morphed, it moved. And I like that because the energy and the consciousness of the word moved as it changed its address and zip code from the cosmic corridors of the celestial to the troubling terrains of the terrestrial. I'm convinced that long before John put his pen to paper to write this particular pericope, the word was moving before we ever got to John's gospel. For if you don't believe me, look with me on the YouTube screens of your imagination and you can see that the word has always been moving. Look there in Genesis during the story of creation as the author paints the picture that the word moved over the face of the waters as it put the sun on the day shift and the moon on night shift, and they never missed a day at work. Oh yes, the word moved as it put its fingers in the sky and sprinkled the stars across the black canvas of the night. But I'm so glad that the word didn't stop moving then, because the word is moving every time you and I stand to preach. Every time you and I move, the word moves. And I'm so glad that the word has not stopped moving in the 21st century.
All right, Ken.
The text says that the word moved
All right.
into the neighborhood.
Yes, sir.
The King James translation says that it dwelt among men. But listen to what the text does not say. It does not say that the word became flesh and was lifted above the people, crowned as a king and paraded around the pulpit. But the text says it moved into the neighborhood. The text says that the word became flesh. But the text does not say that it became flesh and opened up one synagogue in two locations. It says it dwelt among men and women, which means that it felt what the people felt. It cried like the people cried. It lived where the people lived. It walked the streets of Jericho. It cruised the cobblestone roads of Capernaum. It sauntered the sidewalks of Caesarea Philippi and perused the provinces of Palestine. That didn't get you. It dealt with the jealousy from Jerusalem. It felt the burdens of Bethesda. And at times it felt the numbness of Nazareth. Yes, the word moved into the neighborhood. Hence, this passage is indicative that God is not some distant deity to be worshipped.
No.
That operates as a cosmic bellhop, but rather an intrinsic force that empowers us, that enables us, that equips us, encourages us, energizes us, equalizes us, enlightens us, and Big Mama would just simply say that exists among us, Emmanuel, God who is with us. And my sisters and my brothers, in an age of religious pluralism and diversity, not only must our word have a means of transportation, our word must be transportable within itself. For if our word does not transcend the trivial and the trifle affairs of this world, then we merely have a testimony, but it is not transportable. Never forget that we are being called to be the agents of change, that we are the transportation, and that we are the word made flesh. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Yes, it is.
Because there's transformation. Then we see that there's transportation, but there's something that I did not read in the text that is glistening and beckoning and calling for my attention, because it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, lastly because the word causes a transfiguration. For listen closely to what the text says. It says, and the word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. But then John seemingly says something that is interesting, because he says, and we have seen his glory with our own eyes.
Oh my.
And I remember in Dr. King's last speech before he was assassinated, he said, I may not get to the promised land with you.
That's what he said, Reverend.
But I've looked over yonder hills and I've seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
That's what he said.
And perhaps Dr. King saw something in this neighborhood that eyes had not seen and that ears had not heard.
No.
I don't know what Dr. King saw, but I can just imagine with my Baptist holy homiletical imagination that Dr. King saw heterosexuals and homosexuals, black people and white people, all kinds of people living in a society where difference was the common denominator for our existence and not difference. I don't know what Dr. King saw, but perhaps he saw a neighborhood where teachers weren't being given guns because the NRA wants to make a capital of assault rifles, but an equal educational system that makes our children competitive in a global economy. I don't know what Dr. King saw. John says, I can only tell you what I've seen with my own eyes. And I tell you, it's a beautiful thing, yes, to hear about what somebody else has seen, but it's one thing when you see it for yourself. And John says, I've seen that there is a beautiful neighborhood, because I've seen that the word can make a way out of no way. I've seen that the word can make a ministry out of my misery. I've seen that the word can turn my mountains into valleys. I've seen that the word can take my scars and make them sacred symphonies. Maybe that didn't get you. I'll go home on you. My grandmama used to say, I've seen the lightning flashing, and I've heard the thunder roar. I've felt sin's breakers dashing, trying to conquer my soul, but I heard the voice of Jesus. We ain't there to fight on, for he promised never to leave me and never to leave me alone. But in case that didn't get you, my other grandmama would echo the words of David, and she would say, I once was young, and now I'm old, but I've never seen the righteous forsaken, or his bread. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Yes, it is.
And my brothers, God bless you.